At the height of a busy lunch hour, a black man calmly stepped up to a bank counter with a $10 million check, money he had earned. Minutes later, that same check lay torn into pieces, scattered across the floor, while dozens of strangers watched in silence. No shouting, no crime, just assumptions, power, and humiliation unfolding in plain sight. Then everything changed when one unexpected word was spoken, far too late to undo the damage. What happened inside that bank didn't just expose one person's bias. It revealed a truth many still refuse to face. How much does respect really cost in America? Comment and tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And subscribe for more powerful stories that demand to be heard. Brandon Coleman's life had been built on routine, discipline, and quiet persistence. Every day followed a rhythm shaped by responsibility. Early mornings, focused work, and evenings centered around his daughter, Maya. He wasn't chasing attention or validation. He was building something stable, something lasting, the kind of life that didn't make headlines but mattered deeply to the people inside it. To Maya, her father was simply reliable, present, and calm. To the outside world, Brandon was a successful tech entrepreneur who had learned to carry his achievements without announcing them. That morning felt no different from countless others. Brandon handled business matters with precision, treating each task as a step forward rather than a victory to celebrate. The check in his possession represented years of work, late nights, and risks taken when no one else believed enough to invest. It wasn't luck. It wasn't sudden. It was earned. And yet, he knew better than to assume that effort alone guaranteed respect, especially in spaces where perception often arrived before facts. Banks, in particular, had always carried an unspoken tension, not because Brandon Coleman lacked credibility, but because experience had taught him how easily credibility could be questioned. He had seen it happen to others. He had felt it in subtle pauses, extra questions, and looks that lingered just a second too long. Still, he believed that preparation mattered. Documents were organized. Details were clear. There was no reason for this visit to become anything more than routine. Inside the bank, everything appeared orderly and controlled. Polished floors, muted conversations, and an atmosphere that suggested professionalism and fairness. Behind the counter stood Sarah Winters, a branch manager accustomed to authority and procedure. To her, the day was moving quickly, one customer after another. To Brandon, this was another reminder that spaces like this demanded calm and composure above all else. Nearby, Helen Davis waited patiently in line, unaware that she was about to witness a moment she would never forget. She had come in expecting nothing more than a simple transaction, not realizing that silence, too, could become a decision. And somewhere beyond the lobby, James Anderson, a senior executive, was going about his day, completely unaware that his path was about to cross an incident that would challenge everything he believed about professionalism and respect. For Brandon, this was supposed to be simple. Walk in, complete the transaction, walk out. But some moments carry weight long before they reveal it. What began as an ordinary visit was quietly shifting into something far more revealing, about power, assumptions, and how quickly dignity can be tested when no one expects accountability. The moment Brandon handed over the check, the air around the counter subtly changed. What should have been a routine exchange slowed into something heavier, quieter, more deliberate. Sarah's eyes lingered longer than necessary, not on the numbers printed across the paper but on Brandon himself. The pause was small, almost unnoticeable, yet it carried weight. Brandon felt it immediately, the familiar tightening in his chest that came when assumptions arrived before understanding. Procedures began to stack one on top of another, requests that felt excessive, verifications that seemed endless. Each step was framed as policy, as caution, as responsibility, but the rhythm was off. Brandon had navigated financial institutions for years, and he knew when caution crossed into suspicion. The difference wasn't written in manuals. It lived in tone, timing, and body language. He remained calm, steady, offering exactly what was asked, refusing to give discomfort the reaction it seemed to invite. Around them, the bank continued moving. Customers shuffled forward. Pens scratched against paper. Screens glowed softly behind the counters. Yet attention began to drift toward the interaction unfolding at Sarah Winter's station. Something about the prolonged scrutiny drew eyes. People noticed the silence stretching longer than it should have. They noticed Brandon standing still, composed, while authority pressed in on him inch by inch. Helen Davis watched from a few steps back. At first, she assumed there must be an issue with the system or the paperwork. But as minutes passed, the imbalance became harder to ignore. She noticed how Brandon was asked to prove, then reprove, then explain again. She noticed how the tension sat entirely on one side of the counter. Others noticed too, but no one spoke. Silence filled the space where intervention might have lived. The scrutiny intensified. The check, now held between fingers rather than resting flat, became an object of suspicion rather than proof. Brandon could feel the moment slipping from routine into confrontation, though no voices were raised. The injustice wasn't loud. It was clinical, measured, framed as professionalism while stripping him of dignity in real time. Each second stretched the distance between what this moment should have been and what it was becoming. As the pressure mounted, Brandon sensed the shift from verification to judgment. The posture across from him hardened. Decisions were forming without him. He wasn't being evaluated as a client anymore, but as a possibility, one that needed to be controlled. The irony was sharp. Years of discipline, credibility, and earned success were being overshadowed by perception alone. The bank lobby felt smaller now, tighter. Eyes followed movements. Breaths were held. The atmosphere carried an unspoken question. How far would this go? Brandon remained rooted, refusing to shrink, refusing to retreat, even as authority leaned closer. He understood what was happening, even if no one named it. This wasn't about numbers. It was about power and who was assumed to deserve it. Then came the moment that shifted everything. The check was no longer just examined. It was handled with finality. In a move that stunned the space into stillness, Sarah Winters made a choice that erased any illusion of caution. Paper separated under force, the sound cutting through the room with a clarity that couldn't be undone. What had represented years of work, sacrifice, and legitimacy was reduced to pieces in seconds. The room froze. No gasps, no objections, just the quiet shock of witnesses realizing they had crossed into something irreversible. Brandon didn't move. His composure held, even as humiliation was made public. The injustice had escalated beyond suspicion into outright violation, and everyone in the room knew it, even if no one dared to say it. Helen's heart pounded as she watched the moment settle. This was no misunderstanding. This was a decision made with confidence, backed by authority, carried out in front of strangers. And still, the room remained silent. What no one in that moment understood was that the balance of power was about to shift. Somewhere beyond the lobby, James Anderson was moving closer to a situation he hadn't anticipated. The damage had already been done, but accountability was approaching. And when it arrived, it would force everyone present to confront what they had just witnessed, and what their silence had allowed. The tension lingered, thick and unresolved, hanging in the air like a question no one wanted to answer. The seconds after the paper tore felt unreal, like the room itself had lost its breath. The bank lobby, moments ago filled with movement and low conversation, froze into silence. Brandon stood still as fragments of what had represented years of sacrifice settled around his shoes. No one rushed forward. No one spoke. The humiliation wasn't loud. It was precise, intentional, and unmistakably public. Sarah Winters didn't retreat or hesitate. Her posture stayed firm, her authority unchallenged. The act carried a certainty that cut deeper than anger. This wasn't confusion or caution gone wrong. It was judgment delivered without apology. Brandon understood that instantly. Whatever protection professionalism was supposed to offer had vanished, replaced by something far more dangerous, unchecked power. The silence around him grew heavier by the second. People shifted their weight, avoided eye contact, stared at the floor. Helen Davis felt her pulse race as she watched, her instinct urging her to say something, anything. But the moment passed, swallowed by the same quiet that had allowed everything else to happen. In that stillness, Brandon realized he wasn't just standing alone at a counter. He was standing inside a system that expected him to absorb the damage quietly. He didn't react the way fear or anger might have demanded. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. Holding his composure took effort, but it was deliberate. Brandon refused to give the moment what it seemed to want, a reaction that could be used to justify what had already been done. His restraint became its own form of resistance, even as the weight of being publicly reduced pressed down on him. Then the atmosphere shifted. Footsteps echoed from the entrance, steady and confident, cutting through the tension. James Anderson stepped into the lobby, unaware that he had arrived at the exact moment the line between procedure and abuse had been erased. Authority entered the room, and everyone felt it. But authority alone wasn't accountability, at least not yet. Recognition came quickly. Anderson's attention moved from the floor to the counter, then locked onto Brandon's face. The change was immediate and visible. Certainty drained away, replaced by realization. The room felt it before a word was spoken. The power dynamic shifted, not because the harm had been undone, but because it had finally been seen by someone whose presence mattered. Sarah turned toward him, expecting confirmation, maybe even support. What she received instead was distance. The confidence that had guided her actions moments earlier faltered as hierarchy quietly reasserted itself. Brandon hadn't changed. His stance hadn't changed. What changed was recognition, and the contrast was impossible to ignore. Helen watched the shift with disbelief. Respect had arrived suddenly, effortlessly, the moment identity was acknowledged. Minutes earlier, Brandon Coleman had been treated as a risk. Now, urgency and caution shaped the tone around him. The injustice didn't need explanation anymore. It stood exposed, undeniable in its timing. For Brandon, the realization landed harder than the humiliation itself. The respect offered now did nothing to erase what had already occurred. It only confirmed the truth. Dignity had been conditional. Trust had been withheld until denial became inconvenient. That understanding settled deep, sharper than anger, heavier than shame. In that moment, Brandon knew this wasn't just about a torn check or a single decision behind a counter. This was about what happens when systems operate without challenge, and what it costs when silence fills the space where accountability should be. He also knew something else. This moment would not end quietly. Somewhere beyond the walls of this bank, consequences were already taking shape, and the reckoning would not stop here. The room stayed silent, but the silence had changed. It wasn't passive anymore. It was tense, expectant, loaded with what was coming next. The worst had already happened, but the story was far from over. Brandon walked out of the bank carrying nothing but himself. The transaction was unfinished, the damage already done. What stayed behind were torn pieces of paper and the quiet discomfort of those who had watched without intervening. What followed him was clarity, heavy, unavoidable, and permanent. The humiliation hadn't come from a misunderstanding. It had come from certainty, from a system that decided who deserved trust before facts were ever allowed to speak. By the time Brandon Coleman reached home, the silence of the day finally caught up to him. Maya noticed it immediately. He was present but different, quieter, more guarded. He didn't explain everything he didn't need to. She understood enough to know that something unfair had happened. For Brandon, that understanding mattered more than words. What he carried now wasn't just anger, it was responsibility. The incident refused to stay contained, not in his thoughts, not in the questions that followed. What happened inside that bank wasn't rare, it was familiar. A pattern repeated in different places, under different policies, always justified with the same language. Brandon knew staying silent would be easier, but silence was what allowed moments like this to happen again and again. That decision led him to Jordan Hayes. The conversation wasn't emotional, it was precise. Jordan didn't frame what happened as unfortunate or isolated. He named it for what it was: discrimination reinforced by authority and protected by procedure. With Jordan's guidance, Brandon understood that accountability wasn't about revenge. It was about making the system visible, forcing it to answer for what it normalized. Helen Davis made her choice as well. Watching injustice and doing nothing had stayed with her longer than she expected. Speaking up, even after the moment passed, became her way of reclaiming responsibility. What she witnessed mattered because it confirmed a truth too often dismissed. It wasn't just one person's experience. For James Anderson, the reckoning arrived with recognition. Seeing the contrast between how Brandon was treated before and after acknowledgement stripped away any remaining doubt. Respect had not been delayed by confusion. It had been conditional. That realization carried weight that could not be undone. Brandon didn't leave the experience unchanged, but he didn't leave it powerless either. What began as humiliation became resolve, not just for himself, but for the next person who would walk into a space like that expecting fairness. If dignity depends on recognition, how many people are denied it every day simply because no one is watching? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Black Community Struggles for more powerful stories about justice, truth, and our community's fight to be seen. And don't forget to hit the like button. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most.